May 5, 1945. The war in Europe is nearly over. Hitler is dead. Berlin has fallen. The Nazi regime is collapsing. But high in the Austrian Alps, in a medieval castle that looks like something out of a fairy tale, the most bizarre battle of World War II is about to begin. A battle where American soldiers and German Wehrmacht troops will fight side by side against the SS. A battle where French VIPs, including a former prime minister and a tennis champion, will grab rifles and defend the walls. A battle where a German officer will sacrifice himself to save an American major. This is the Battle of Castle Itter, and it is without question the strangest, most unlikely alliance in the history of modern warfare. This is a story where the lines between enemy and ally blur, where honor means more than orders, where desperate circumstances create impossible friendships, and where the last shots of World War II in Europe create a legend that sounds too crazy to be true. But every word of this story is real. To understand how this incredible battle happened, we need to go back 4 years to 1941, when Castle Itter was transformed from a medieval fortress into a very special kind of prison. The castle sits on a hilltop in the Tyrolean Alps near the town of Virgil, Austria, a picturesque building with towers and thick stone walls that had stood for centuries. The SS took it over and converted it into a prison for high-value French prisoners, people who were too important to execute, but too dangerous to set free. This wasn't a concentration camp like Auschwitz or Dachau. There were no gas chambers, no mass executions. Instead, it was a gilded cage for French VIPs, politicians, generals, intellectuals, and celebrities who had either opposed the Nazis or were useful as hostages. By 1943, the castle housed some of the most prominent figures in French society. There was Édouard Daladier, who had been Prime Minister of France before the war, the man who had signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler in 1938. There was Paul Reynaud, who had been Prime Minister when France fell in 1940 and had wanted to keep fighting. There was General Maurice Gamelin, who had been the supreme commander of French forces at the start of the war. There was Maxime Weygand, another general who had tried to organize French resistance. There was François de la Roque, a right-wing politician and war hero. There was Michel Clemenceau, son of Georges Clemenceau, the legendary French prime minister from World War I. There was Marie-Agnès Caillot, the sister of Charles de Gaulle himself. And then there was Jean Borotra, the bounding Basque, one of the most famous tennis players in the world, a Wimbledon champion who had been imprisoned for refusing to collaborate with the Nazis. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were symbols, each one representing a piece of France's political and cultural elite, held by the Nazis as insurance, as bargaining chips for a future that was looking increasingly bleak for the Third Reich. Life in Castle Itter was strange. The prisoners were guarded by SS troops, but they weren't treated like concentration camp inmates. They had rooms, not cells. They could exercise in the courtyard. They could receive some packages. They could even socialize with each other, though they were under constant surveillance. But make no mistake, this was still a prison. They couldn't leave. They lived in constant uncertainty about their fate, and they knew that if the SS decided they were no longer useful, they could be executed at any moment. The guards were professionals, mostly older SS men who weren't particularly cruel, but were absolutely loyal to the regime. The prisoners tried to maintain their dignity, dressing for dinner when they could, discussing politics and philosophy, playing cards, anything to maintain some semblance of normal life. Borotra, the tennis champion, would exercise obsessively, running laps in the courtyard, doing calisthenics, staying fit because that's what athletes do, even in prison. The politicians would argue about what had gone wrong with France, what should have been done differently, what would happen after the war. They had nothing but time and uncertainty. As 1944 turned into 1945, and it became clear that Germany was losing the war, the mood in the castle changed. The prisoners began to hope they might survive, but they also feared that the SS would kill them all before the Allies arrived, eliminating witnesses and denying the Allies their propaganda victory. The guards became more nervous, more unpredictable. Everyone could feel that something was coming, that the end was near, but nobody knew what that end would look like. Then, on April 30th, 1945, everything changed. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin. On May 2nd, Berlin fell to the Soviets. The Nazi regime was collapsing, and suddenly the SS guards at Castle Itter had a decision to make. Some of them fled immediately, disappearing into the mountains, hoping to escape justice. Others stayed, bound by duty or fear or simple inertia. By May 3rd, most of the guards were gone, and the castle was defended by just a handful of SS men who weren't sure what to do. The senior officer, an SS Hauptsturmführer named Sebastian Wimmer, realized the war was over and he was on the losing side. He gathered the remaining guards and told them they could leave if they wanted, and most of them did. Wimmer himself left on May 4th, but before he went, he did something extraordinary. He went to the prisoners and told them they were free to go, but he warned them that the SS Totenkopf Division, the Death's Head Division, one of the most fanatical SS units, was in the area and might come to the castle to kill them all rather than let them be liberated. He suggested they stay in the castle where the walls could protect them and try to contact the Americans who were advancing through Austria. Then Wimmer left, and the prisoners were alone in a medieval castle in the Alps, with no guards, no protection, and a fanatical SS division possibly heading their way. The prisoners didn't know what to do. They were free, but free to do what? Walk down the mountain into a countryside still full of German troops and SS fanatics? They decided to stay in the castle and try to get help. Jean Barotra, the tennis player, volunteered for a dangerous mission. He would run down the mountain, through territory still controlled by German forces, and try to reach the Americans. It was insane, suicidal even. But Barotra was an athlete. He was fast, he was brave, and he was willing to try. On the morning of May 4th, he slipped out of the castle and started running. He made it through German lines, somehow avoiding patrols, and eventually encountered an American reconnaissance unit. He told them about the prisoners in the castle, about the danger they were in, and begged for help. The Americans were skeptical at first. This French guy in prison clothes claiming to be a famous tennis player and asking them to rescue French VIPs from a castle? It sounded like a joke or a trap. But Barotra was convincing, and eventually he was taken to meet Captain John C. Jack Lee, Jr., a tank commander with the 12th Armored Division who had a reputation for being aggressive and unconventional. Lee listened to the story and made a decision that would define his life. He was going to rescue those prisoners, orders or no orders. But Lee had a problem. He only had one tank, a Sherman named Besotten Jenny, and a handful of men. He couldn't take a medieval castle with that, especially not if SS troops were in the area. He needed help, and he was about to get it from the most unlikely source imaginable. As Lee was planning his move, he encountered a German Wehrmacht officer named Major Joseph Sepp Gangl. Now, you have to understand, this is May 4th, 1945. The war is basically over, but it's not officially over, and American and German forces are still shooting at each other. But Gangl wasn't a Nazi. He was a professional soldier who had become disillusioned with the regime, and he had been secretly helping the Austrian resistance in the final days of the war. When he heard about the situation at Castle Itter, he made a decision that could have gotten him executed by his own side. He approached Lee under a white flag and offered to help. Gangl brought with him about 10 Wehrmacht soldiers who were loyal to him, men who were done with the war and wanted to do one last decent thing before it all ended. Lee had to make an impossible decision. Trust a German officer he'd just met and who, technically, he was still at war with, or try to rescue the prisoners alone and probably fail. Lee chose to trust Gangl, and one of history's strangest alliances was formed right there on a mountain road in Austria. Lee, Gangl, the American soldiers, the German Wehrmacht troops, and Borotra headed up the mountain to Castle Itter. They arrived on the evening of May 4th and entered the castle, to the absolute shock of the French prisoners, who suddenly saw American and German soldiers walking in together, not fighting, but cooperating. Lee took command of the defense and assessed the situation. The castle was defensible but vulnerable. It had thick medieval walls, but it also had large windows and a gate that wouldn't stand up to serious assault. He had 1 Sherman tank, about 14 American soldiers, 10 German Wehrmacht soldiers, and now the French prisoners, some of whom grabbed weapons and volunteered to fight. Edouard Daladier, the former prime minister, took up a rifle. So did Paul Reynaud. Tennis champion Jean Borotra was ready to fight. These elderly politicians and a middle-aged athlete were about to become soldiers. Lee positioned his forces carefully. The Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny, was parked in the castle courtyard where its gun could cover the main approach. American and German soldiers were mixed together on the walls, each covering different approaches to the castle. The French prisoners who could fight were given weapons and positions. Lee made it clear that nationality didn't matter anymore. They were all defenders of Castle Itter, and they would stand together or fall together. Then they waited, because everyone knew the SS were coming. The SS arrived in force on the morning of May 5th, just after dawn. It wasn't the entire Death's Head division, but it was a significant force. Probably 100 to 150 fanatical SS troops with machine guns, Panzerfausts, and a willingness to die for a cause that was already lost. They had heard about the situation at Castle Itter, about the high-value French prisoners, and they wanted to kill them before the Americans could claim a propaganda victory. When they saw American and German troops defending the castle together, they must have thought they were hallucinating. But it didn't stop them. The SS opened fire, and the battle began. Machine gun fire raked the castle walls. Panzerfaust rockets exploded against the medieval stone. The Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny, fired back, its 75mm gun booming across the mountain valley. American and German soldiers fired side by side, calling out targets to each other, sharing ammunition, working together as if they'd been allies all along. The French prisoners, these elderly politicians who hadn't held a rifle in years, fired from the windows, surprising themselves with their own courage. The SS kept coming, wave after wave, trying to storm the gates, trying to get close enough to use their Panzerfausts to blow the gates open. The defenders held them off, barely, but everyone knew they couldn't last forever. They were outnumbered and surrounded. Ammunition was running low, and the SS weren't going to give up. Then disaster struck. A Panzerfaust hit Besotten Jenny, the Sherman tank, destroying it and killing the tank commander. The castle's main defensive weapon was gone, and the SS sensed victory. They pressed harder, getting closer to the walls, preparing for a final assault. Major Gongol, the German officer who had betrayed his own side to do the right thing, was directing fire from an exposed position when he saw an SS sniper lining up a shot at one of the French prisoners. Without hesitation, Gangel threw himself in front of the prisoner and took the bullet. He died instantly, saving a French politician he'd never met before that day, giving his life for people who should have been his enemies. It was an act of pure heroism, the kind of selflessness that defines what it means to be a soldier in the truest sense of the word. The defenders were now desperate. They were out of time and almost out of ammunition. Lee knew they couldn't hold much longer, and he made a decision. He sent a runner, somehow getting a man through the SS cordon, to reach American forces and call for immediate reinforcements. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. And then, like cavalry in a Western movie, the Americans arrived. A relief force from the 142nd Infantry Regiment had received Lee's message and rushed to Castle Itter. When they arrived in force with tanks and artillery support, the SS, seeing they were now hopelessly outnumbered and facing fresh American troops, broke and ran. Some were killed in the fighting, others were captured, and many escaped into the mountains, where they would eventually be hunted down. The Battle of Castle Itter was over. It had lasted about 4 hours, but in that time, it had accomplished something extraordinary. American and German soldiers had fought together against a common enemy. A German officer had died saving French prisoners from his own countrymen. French politicians had taken up arms and fought like soldiers, and a medieval castle in the Alps had become the site of the last battle of World War II in Europe, and certainly the strangest. The aftermath of the battle was remarkable. All of the French prisoners survived and were freed. They returned to France as heroes, their ordeal over. Édouard Daladier would live until 1970, spending his final years writing and reflecting on the war. Paul Reynaud would serve in the French government again. Jean Borotra, the tennis champion who had risked his life to get help, would live until 1994, playing tennis into his 90s and always remembering the day he defended a castle with a rifle. Captain Jack Lee was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions, but he rarely talked about the battle, perhaps because it was so unusual that people wouldn't believe him. The German soldiers who had fought alongside the Americans were treated well by their former enemies. They were processed as prisoners of war, but were quickly released, and many stayed in contact with Lee and the American soldiers they had fought beside, forming friendships that would last the rest of their lives. Major Joseph Gangel, the German officer who had betrayed his own army to save French prisoners and died doing it, was honored as a hero by the people of Vergel. A street in the town was named after him, and a memorial was erected. He is remembered not as a Nazi or even as a German soldier, but as a man who chose honor over orders, who chose humanity over ideology, and who gave his life for people he barely knew because it was the right thing to do. The Battle of Castle Itter asks us to think about what it means to be a soldier, what it means to be honorable, and what it means to be human. Here were men who, just days before, would have been trying to kill each other, suddenly standing shoulder to shoulder, defending the same walls, fighting for the same cause. Here was a German officer who had spent years fighting for Germany, who had followed orders and done his duty, suddenly deciding that his duty was to humanity, not to a regime that had lost all legitimacy. Here were French prisoners, civilians really, who could have stayed cowering in their rooms but instead chose to fight, to take up arms and defend not just themselves, but the principle that they would not go quietly into the night. And here was an American captain who could have followed the safe path, could have waited for orders, could have let someone else take the risk. but instead chose to trust a former enemy and lead a desperate defense of a castle he'd never heard of until the day before. What made these men do what they did? It wasn't orders from above, because Lee was essentially acting on his own, and Gangel was directly disobeying what remained of German command. It wasn't patriotism in the traditional sense, because Americans and Germans were fighting on the same side. It wasn't even survival, because they could have all walked away and let the SS have the castle and the prisoners. No, what drove them was something deeper, something more fundamental. It was the recognition that in the chaos and cruelty of war, in the final desperate days of a conflict that had killed millions, there was still room for honor, still room for humanity, still room for doing the right thing even when the right thing was strange and unprecedented and dangerous. The Battle of Castle Itter reminds us that war is not simple, that enemies and allies are not always clearly defined, and that individuals can choose to rise above the circumstances they find themselves in. The SS troops who attacked the castle were following their fanatical ideology to the bitter end, choosing hatred and violence even when the war was clearly lost. But Lee and Gangel and Barotra and the others, they chose something different. They chose to see each other not as enemies defined by nationality or uniform, but as soldiers and men who shared a common cause. They chose to protect the weak and the vulnerable, to stand against cruelty and murder, to fight for something beyond themselves. In doing so, they created one of the most remarkable moments of World War II. A moment when the lines that had divided Europe for 6 years suddenly didn't matter anymore. When American and German soldiers proved that they were more alike than different, that they shared the same basic values of courage and honor and decency. The battle itself was small, just a few hours of fighting in a castle that most people had never heard of, but its significance is enormous because it shows us what is possible when people choose humanity over ideology, when they choose to do what is right rather than what is easy. Today, Castle Itter still stands in the Austrian Alps, a beautiful medieval fortress with a view of the mountains. There's a memorial plaque there now, commemorating the battle and honoring both the Americans and Germans who fought together. Major Gangel's name is prominent, remembering his sacrifice. Tourists visit the castle, but most of them don't know the story, don't know about the strange day in May 1945, when this fairy tale castle became the site of the strangest battle of World War II. But the story deserves to be remembered, not just as a curiosity or a footnote to history, but as an example of what soldiers can be at their best. Captain Jack Lee, Major Joseph Gangel, Jean Barotra, and all the others who fought at Castle Itter showed us that even in the darkest times, even in the final desperate hours of the most destructive war in human history, individuals can choose honor over hatred, can choose cooperation over conflict, can choose to protect life rather than take it. They showed us that the uniforms we wear and the flags we fight under don't define who we are as deeply as the choices we make and the values we hold. And they showed us that sometimes, just sometimes, former enemies can become brothers in arms, fighting side by side for something that transcends national boundaries and political ideologies, fighting simply for what is right. So remember the Battle of Castle Itter. Remember the American captain who trusted a German major. Remember the German major who died saving French prisoners. Remember the tennis champion who ran through enemy lines to get help. Remember the elderly politicians who grabbed rifles and fought like young soldiers. Remember the American and German troops who stood shoulder to shoulder on medieval walls and fought against the fanatics who refused to let the war end. Remember that on May 5, 1945, in a castle in the Austrian Alps, something remarkable happened. something that gives us hope even now. Because if American and German soldiers could put aside their differences and fight together in 1945, after 6 years of terrible war, then maybe, just maybe, we can find ways to overcome our divisions today. Maybe we can choose to see our common humanity rather than our differences. Maybe we can choose honor and courage and decency over hatred and violence and fanaticism. The Battle of Castle Itter tells us that it's possible because it happened once, on a mountain in Austria, when men who should have been enemies became allies, became heroes, became a testament to the best of what humanity can be, even in the worst of times.